Dave Talks Comics, Episode 67, Batman, A Death in the Family, and Blades. Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, a program on the subjects of comic books and cartoons. I talk about comic books I have read and cartoons I have watched. I talk from my notes. I don't go panel by panel or scene by scene. I try to do more than just summarize the stories. This program is not spoiler-free. I try not to spoil everything, but in the process of talking about these comic books and cartoons, I will probably spoil them in some way. On this episode of Dave Talks Comics, I will be talking about two Batman stories from the late 80s and early 90s. The story from the late 80s is A Death in the Family, which is fairly well known, and I will get into it fairly soon, why it's well known, if you don't already know already. And the other story is not as well known, although the creators who worked on it, the writer and the penciler, are fairly well known. And I also believe it has not been reprinted before. It might be available digitally, but I'm not certain on that. Batman: A Death in the Family was first printed in Batman issues 426 to 429. These issues were cover dated December of 88 through January of 89, so there was 2 issues each month. In fact, the first one was December of 88, then it was Holiday 88, Winter 89, January of 89. And the first 2 issues were double-sized, I think. There was 2 chapters in each, and then the last 2 issues was just 1 chapter each, so there's 6 chapters, although there's only 4 issues. The story was written by Jim Starlin and drawn by Jim Aparo, with inks by Mike DiCarlo. The first issue, well, let's see. The story opens, the thing to know about this story is this is the story where, this is after Dick Grayson has become Nightwing. This is 88. I think Grayson became Nightwing in 84 or 85, something like that. It was right around the time of the Judas contract when that happened. And Batman at first worked solo. Now he's been working with Jason Todd, who is the second Robin. Anyway, the story begins with, this is the story where Robin gets killed, basically. I think that's what I was starting to say, and that I kind of interrupted myself. But this is the story where Robin gets killed by the Joker, where the Joker beats him to death. And yeah, I warned you about spoilers at the beginning, so and honestly, who doesn't know that this is the story where the Joker beats Robin to death? So, to give you kind of an idea of how this story shapes up, basically, Jason Todd goes back to his old home. His parents are gone. He gets some pictures that his parents had left and some documents, and he discovers that his parents weren't his real parents. But he's able to narrow the possibilities down of his real mother down to 3 women. One is Charmin Rosen, who's an Israeli spy. Another one is Shiva Wusan, who's also known as Lady Shiva. And the other one is Dr. Sheila Hayward, who is a social worker in Ethiopia. So, without asking permission, Jason takes off for the Middle East to hunt down these 3 women. Well, 2 of them are in the Middle East, one's in Africa. And he takes off without saying anything to Batman. At the same time, Batman discovers that the Joker has gotten his hands on a cruise missile, and so he takes off after the Joker. And at first he has to make this decision. Does he follow the Joker? Does he follow Jason Todd? He ends up following the Joker, but it doesn't matter because his path ends up crossing Robin's path because they're both in the same area. And it turns out that the first woman that Robin's going to see, Charmin Rosen, is actually working on the case, is actually tracking some of the people who are trying to buy this cruise missile from the Joker. So in the end, basically, they end up working together to stop the Joker from selling this cruise missile, and then they cross paths with the Joker again in Ethiopia, and it's an okay story. I honestly, I read it because it's considered to be a classic, or I don't know if it's a classic, but it's definitely a milestone or an important story. I like Jim Apparo's artwork, but I tend to associate his artwork with The Brave and the Bold and with Batman and the Outsiders. And I don't know, something about Jim Starlin's writing with Jim Apparo's artwork, I don't know, it just doesn't completely work for me. I don't think that Jim Apparo's stuff has to be silly or wacky, but I don't know. I think Starlin's writing here, it just seemed a little too serious. I don't know. The artwork didn't completely work for me in this case, and it wasn't that it wasn't nicely drawn. It's just that it just wasn't the right style, I think. And I don't know. I wasn't crazy about the fact that Jim Aparo was the one drawing the story. And to be perfectly honest, I have not read a Jim Starlin Batman story that I've really loved. This is only the second one that I've read, the other one being The Cult, which is another one that I've heard people say good things about, but it didn't do much for me. Honestly, it's been about 10 years since I read that, but that's how I feel about that story. Is there anything else about... Yeah, there's this wacky part where the Joker becomes the ambassador from Iran to the United Nations, which I thought was kind of strange. It was like almost a completely different tone from the rest of the story, because it was really wacky, the fact that the Joker would be the one to be... and of course this gives him diplomatic immunity, and so then Batman, then Superman intervenes and says, hey, you can't arrest him, you can't stop him, he's now the ambassador, he's now got diplomatic immunity, and, on the whole, I wasn't crazy about this. I read it because it's considered to be a classic. I had hopes for it that it would be better than it was, but it didn't take long for me to see that it wasn't the story for me. I don't think it's a great Batman story. I don't think it's an awful story. I don't know. I wanted to read it. I wanted to say something about it, and now I have. And just to follow up on a couple things, Jason Todd, who was the second sidekick to Batman, the second Robin, first appeared in 1983, in early 1983, and within a couple issues was showing up as Robin. Now, he was revamped after Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1987, and it was only about a year and a half later that he was killed in late 1988, early 1989, in this Death in the Family, Batman: A Death in the Family. The original Robin at this point had become Nightwing, and that happened in the Judas Contract, which was a story in the Teen Titans. Actually, at that point, it had become Tales of the Teen Titans, which shouldn't be confused with Tales of the New Teen Titans, which was a mini-series which had appeared a few years earlier. So Tales of the Teen Titans number 43, which was part 2 of the Judas Contract, was the first appearance of Dick Grayson as Nightwing. Batman Blades. This is a story that I don't think it's ever been reprinted. It's from Legends of the Dark Knight, or Batman Legends of the Dark Knight, issues 32 to 34, which are cover dated late June 1992 to late July 1992. So I think this was being published bi-monthly at that point, as in twice a month. The story is written by James Robinson, and the art is by Tim Sale. This is some of his earliest work at DC Comics. He had done the prior year, he had done the Challengers of the Unknown with Jeff Loeb, which I believe was their first collaboration. So that was in 1991. This is 1992, so if you've read that, the art in this looks very similar to the art in that. It's definitely the same era of Jeff Loeb, or of Tim Sale, and it's not quite as... I think in some ways I actually like it better than the art in something like The Long Halloween, which came maybe 5 years later. I'm not sure exactly when. Anyway, the story is about, it's kind of split in two. And you have Batman, and he is on the trail of a serial killer whose name is Mr. Lime, who has been bumping off old people. At the same time, you have the Cavalier, who is a new vigilante who is kind of like Zorro. He fights using a sword. He wears a mask, which is just basically a scarf tied around his head, the top of his head with eye holes in it. And he even dresses a little bit like Zorro, or like a throwback to that. The other thing that's interesting about this is that it's not just the story has two narrators. You have Batman narrating and you have the Cavalier narrating, and they do two different styles of fonts or narration boxes for the two, so it's very easy to tell who's talking. So the first issue kind of introduces the Cavalier. You see both of them rescuing people near the end of the story. In Batman's case, it's just one more case of him. He's rescuing somebody who's in a burning building that's about to be, Mr. Lime has set on fire. And in the case of the Cavalier, he's rescuing a woman who's jumped off a bridge. And for the Cavalier, it's a much bigger deal because he falls in love with this woman, and him falling in love with this woman kind of, it has to do with, the story takes off from there, or what comes after this is all because he saves her and falls in love with her. It's worth noting that the Cavalier is a stuntman by day, and he and Batman do meet in this issue. The thing is that Batman is so obsessed with finding this serial killer that he doesn't have time to deal with the Cavalier. I mean, the Cavalier is a crime fighter. He's a vigilante like Batman, and he's fighting, he's helping the police just like Batman. Batman isn't crazy about it, but at the same time, he could use the help, or he knows that the police could use the help, and he doesn't have the time to deal with the Cavalier, with trying to get the Cavalier to stop or to hang up his mask. So that's the first issue. Now in the second issue, you find out there's more to the Cavalier than meets the eye, and it turns out that he's been performing some robberies. And then later on, you'll find out that this has to do with this woman who he saved from jumping off the bridge. And at the same time, you've got Batman, who is still on the trail of Mr. Lime, trying to track him down, driving himself nuts, making himself sick because he's up so long. He just can't figure out he can't find the piece to solve this puzzle. And I got to say, the artwork in this is great. I really like the way that Loeb draws this. Loeb. I keep saying Loeb. Tim Sale draws this. It's really very beautiful. It's really very evocative. I really like the way he does things, especially with shadows, and the pacing of the story is great. And in this story, you finally see a confrontation between Batman and the Cavalier, and that's because Batman catches the Cavalier in the midst of a robbery, performing a robbery. And then finally, in the third and final issue of this series, of this story, the cover kind of gives away what happens, which has a sword fight between Batman and the Cavalier, and which is something that happens, something that does happen in the issue. Sometimes they show things on the covers of comics that don't. And actually, it was only when I got to this issue, when I was putting together my notes for this discussion, for this episode about Blades, that I put two and two together. Batman is chasing down somebody whose name is Mr. Lime, and the Cavalier is chasing down a villain who has something on his is it Eleanor? Ellen's. Ellen is the woman who he saved from jumping off the bridge, and he's fallen in love with her. And he finds out the reason why she was trying to jump off the bridge was she killed her husband, who had been abusing her, and she had been holding back, and then finally she grabbed a knife and killed him one day. And somebody found out about this, and that somebody is a gangster by the name of Mr. Salt. Well, I read this whole story, and I didn't put two and two together until I was putting my notes together for this. And Batman's chasing a guy named Mr. Lime, and the Cavalier is dealing with a guy named Mr. Salt. Salt and Lime, Okay, if you know anything, then maybe you understand the humor there. I couldn't put any other connection to this. I'm not sure if there's anything else to that. I couldn't find anything else in the story that, there any mention of tequila or anything like that, but maybe I just missed something. Maybe the fact that the Cavalier is a bit like Zorro, and Zorro came from Mexico. I'm not sure. But the Cavalier claims to be somebody who's there to fight the good fight, even though he does steal. And the reason why you find out why he's stealing is because he's trying to buy the evidence that Salt has on. He has the murder weapon, and the Cavalier is trying to get that so that Ellen won't have to worry about the police coming after her, so that she'll have everything. She'll be able to go free, and then he goes to confront Salt, and Salt basically says, "Well, here you can have the knife, but I still know this," And then the Cavalier kind of snaps and basically kills Salt. And then what happens is you get a confrontation between Batman and the Cavalier, and Batman's ready to let the Cavalier go, and then the Cavalier says, "Yeah, but I killed somebody," and it's kind of, and so then he throws Batman a sword, and then you get this great sword fight along the rooftops of Gotham between the Cavalier and Batman, which I guess I won't say who wins it. The ending was a bit abrupt, I thought. In reading through it a second time, I kind of understand it, and it's a little bit frustrating. I don't think it's bad. I think it's just a little frustrating, and I think that's because of the way the reasoning, what goes through the mind of the Cavalier. I don't completely agree with it. I don't know. But this is the way that James Robinson decided to tell the story. James Robinson and Tim Sale decided to tell the story, decided to put it together. And I think it works. I will say that I thought that it did feel a little bit rushed, and I wish that it had taken. I wish that they had taken an extra issue to tell the story. I'm sure that wasn't. Well, I don't know if it was their choice or not. But the third part definitely felt a little rushed. I'm not sure where you would break the story, how to break the story into 4 parts instead of 3. I think they chose good break points. There is definitely a beginning, middle, and end to this story. And you do get Batman does finally solve the mystery of Mr. Lime in the 3rd issue. You definitely see Batman getting roughed up in this issue, both when confronting Mr. Lime and then when his fight with the Cavalier. So I kind of wish that the story had been a little bit longer than it is. It definitely did not feel decompressed at all. It definitely felt like they told the story. If anything, they rushed it a little bit. I wish they had taken a little more time with this story. But I think it's a really good story. As I understand it, it's never been reprinted. I found this at when I was looking through back issue bins at the Baltimore Comic-Con last year, and I pulled this one out, and I was interested because of who wrote it and who drew it, and I'd never read these before. So I think it's a really good story. So if you can find these issues, or if you've got these issues, I think they're worth pulling out again and reading. So it's called Batman. It's from Batman Legends of the Dark Knight, issues 32 through 34, and the writer is James Robinson. The artist is Tim Sale, and I think it's a really fun read, and I really enjoyed it. That's it for episode 67 of Dave Talks Comics. Dave Talks Comics can be found on the web at davetalkscomics.com and facebook.com/DaveTalksComics. On Twitter, at DaveTalksComics. Email can be sent to davetalkscomics@gmail.com. If you're looking for more information on comic books, then I recommend trying comicbookdb.com or comics.org. For a more complete list of websites I use when preparing to record an episode of Dave Talks Comics, go to davetalkscomics.com and click on the links link near the top of the page. Next time on Dave Talks Comics, I will be talking about a couple anime series that I've been watching recently. One is from the late 70s, and the other is from just a couple years ago. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.
Diplomatic community.
It's just been revoked.